Hello and welcome to another episode of the Smart Freight Center Academy podcast, where we share interesting and important information and updates about freight decarbonization and the drive towards a zero emissions logistics industry. My name is Andy Golding. I'm the head of Academy here at Smart Freight Center, or SFC, as you'll hear us call it, and I'm your host for today. You are currently listening to episode 2 of a 3-part series, and the aspect of freight decarbonization that we're covering in this series is fleet electrification and electric vehicles, or road freight electrification, as we call it at SFC. In this series of shortcasts, we're talking about various topics in road freight electrification, the work that Smart Freight Center is doing, and really just helping the broader audience of freight stakeholders get a better understanding of what does this topic mean? What do we need to be thinking about? What are the amazing benefits of road freight electrification and how it fits into freight decarbonization as a whole? For this series, I'm joined by my very funny and very witty colleague, Tharsis Teoh. And without further ado, let's drive into episode 2. Episode 1, we looked at understanding road freight electrification. Today, in this episode, we're going to focus on Smart Freight Center's focus on electric vehicles. And episode 3, which will come up soon, is around the need and the role of education in road freight electrification. Tharsis, it is great to have you back with us today.
Glad to be back.
Tharsis, why electric vehicle? Why is Smart Freight Center, and you did touch on this briefly in episode 1, but why has Smart Freight Center focused a lot on road freight electrification as a sustainability solution for the freight industry?
Right. So, Smart Freight Center's mission is to decarbonize the logistics sector. And we're really focused on what are the solutions that are most effective and that can be attained now. So we're not thinking, 100 years in the future or even 10, 50 years in the future. We're thinking about what we can do now. And electric vehicles have that potential to decarbonize the road freight sector quite effectively. And in the long run, it looks like that will be the best solution, the most optimal solution for the industry in terms also of the costs and the ability to scale up. So we've looked at other types of emissions reduction solutions. And of course, this is on top of all the energy efficiency measures that you need to take. And if you can do modal shift, like shifting your freight onto barges or rail, that'll also be good. Right. So we're going back to the mission of the Smart Freight Center, and that's to reduce and decarbonize the logistics sector. And we know that the road freight sector is a particularly difficult sector to decarbonize. Road freight emissions are still increasing, and they're increasing all over the world, despite energy efficiency measures that have been introduced to a large scale, and despite also the increase in the use of biofuels in the current diesel blends. We think that electric vehicles can play a long-term solution to decarbonizing the sector because it can also, besides it being also effective for each vehicle, it can also quickly scale up. Electricity is available everywhere. And you can't say the same for biofuels. So we think that the electric freight vehicle is a good technological solution to decarbonize the road freight sector.
You've just said that road freight emissions are increasing globally. That's really interesting to me. And we're looking at, as Smart Freight Center, we are looking at road freight electrification as one of the most effective ways to decarbonize freight now. And what about the cost of road freight electrification versus the road freight electrification's ability to scale in comparison to other fuels and other options?
That's a good question. Let's talk about what we think is the best transition fuel or a transition solution, and that's biofuels, specifically sustainable biofuels. In many parts of Europe, as well as in the US, there is an increasing supply of drop-in biofuels that can be used directly in a diesel truck. However, the availability of such fuels is quite limited. It's produced in a large part either by oil crops, which have to be very sustainable. They shouldn't destroy large plots of land and destroy forests. So they need to be sustainable. And they're also produced from waste, from different types of waste. But obviously the supply of that can be very limited, and it's definitely insufficient to supply the entire road freight sector with that. So availability of biofuels is a limiting factor for the use of biofuels at scale. But what we see with electric freight vehicles is that and it's already starting to happen, once electric vehicles start being mass produced for the freight sector, it's going to be very easy to procure renewable electricity for those vehicles. It will be difficult in the short term because of all the transition that needs to happen, the infrastructure that needs to be built, and also adapting operations to the technical constraints of an electric freight vehicle. But in the long run, this is going to be the best option for the industry.
You're talking about industrial change at an immense global scale. Of course, it's going to be difficult. There's so much that needs to change. In episode 1, we spoke about how organizations and fleet operators may actually be able to supply their EVs with fuel or electricity from their own generation sources. So like solar panels on the roofs was an example that you used. But getting to that point requires massive industry-wide shift. But also some of the most important changes that the world has seen at large have required us to fundamentally shift the way that we've always done things. As you're speaking, the image that's coming to mind is when we transitioned from horse-drawn carriages to motorized vehicles, thanks Henry Ford. And that also required massive shift. And obviously that launched industries and changed things. But it shouldn't be a daunting factor. I think, if anything, it should be an exciting factor. And why the role of Smart Freight Center matters so much is, as you've said, we need industry-wide shift. We need to be working with other partners. But we spoke in the previous episode around some of the benefits of EVs. We're talking global scale. So what about the global trends? Where do EVs fit into global transportation trend?
That's a big question. Let's see whether I can answer this. Well, firstly, let's say most of the truck manufacturers around the world, the leading truck manufacturers around the world, are located in Europe. And that means that whatever happens in Europe, there's a lot of potential for the technologies that are developed in Europe and applied in Europe at a wide scale to also be adopted in other regions. So we see, what we think could happen is that once manufacturers are fully on board and they have perfected the electric freight vehicle, perfected their production methods, everything is streamlined, we could see a massive rollout around the world of electric freight vehicles produced wherever they are going to be used. That's one thing. So manufacturers are becoming increasingly competent at producing electric freight vehicles for the industry. Another thing we see is that governments are getting on board. What we see at the policy front is also quite optimistic. A lot of governments around the world have signed up to something called the Global Memorandum of Understanding. And basically what they've committed to is to increase the share of zero emission medium to heavy duty vehicles sold in their countries by 30% over the next couple of years and 100% by 2040. And this means that governments are going to implement regulations and change basically the policy landscape in their own countries to make electric freight vehicles convenient, maybe cheaper, but definitely the dominant truck technology to be used in the logistics sector. And maybe the last point would be that we see that around the world, businesses are becoming a lot more sensitive to their impacts on climate change, in addition to other things, obviously. And they are more interested in reducing that emissions in the road freight sector. And some of our members are, of course, leading that front. And since they have global supply chains, we know that they're also going to try to introduce electric freight vehicles around the world, wherever their operations are.
Sounds like it's a multi-stakeholder question that would get us to fleet electrification, but it also sounds like the multiple stakeholders are getting involved, having the realizations that need to be had, and starting to do the work that needs to be done. The fact that suppliers are getting more adept at building high quality, high efficiency EVs. You've got the manufacturing check. Governments getting involved with this global MOU that you've mentioned. So policy and, I suppose, in some ways, incentivization that would come with making that policy sustainable and implementable, check. Then we've got businesses coming to the realization that we need to make changes, check. So it sounds like in the scope of the global trends, all of the proverbial stars are aligning to provide a very ripe playground for fleet electrification.
Exactly. I would say it's a lot of things have been working in the below underground, and they're just coming up to surface now. And so I think we'll see a massive change very quickly in the next couple of years.
Get on board, it's happening.
Exactly.
It's almost like, that saying, it happened very, very slowly and then all of a sudden. And it feels like maybe we're approaching that point with road freight electrification, because as you say, there's a lot that's been happening for a long time in what to many may be the background. It may not be obvious work that's happening, but there have been a lot of important players having a lot of important conversations and laying very important groundwork for this orchard to kind of come to fruition and all of this to start happening. On that note, can you tell us a little bit more about the work that Smart Freight Center is doing with EVs?
Right, we're doing quite a lot of different things, and we're trying to tackle the whole transition challenge from multiple fronts. Let's say, so most of our members are from the logistics sector. They're either shippers or they're carriers or fleet operators or logistics service providers. And a lot of them are interested in seeing the ecosystem change. So the main thing that we're doing here is that we're aggregating this demand. We're aggregating the signals that are provided by our members or from the logistics sector, and we're channeling them towards addressing the challenges of vehicle availability and affordability, charging infrastructure, and also the solutions for financing the vehicles. And the last point, maybe should clarify that a bit. Because the vehicle is a lot more expensive, firstly, it's a new vehicle, and it's a lot more high tech, and also it has a lot of good benefits. So the vehicle is a lot more expensive. Supply chains all being improved and so on. And that means since it's a lot more expensive, most fleet operators do need some assistance in purchasing these vehicles. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to make sure that there is sufficient financial assistance, whether it's provided by the government or by the private finance sector. So we're addressing three, I guess, big topics: vehicles, charging infrastructure, and the finance. And at the same time, we're looking at something which is a bit more horizontal. We're looking at policy. We're trying to support good, strong policies that enable the ecosystem to be built and directs the ecosystem to be built in the most efficient way possible, and the quicker the better. And at the same time, we're also supporting companies in understanding the transition and getting the best knowledge that they need in order to transition properly and smoothly and adopt the vehicles in a way that makes sense in their context.
Makes sense in their context. I think that's so important is, for organizations to have access to insights, knowledge, and just the tools and access to opportunities that would best serve them and their own transition. You've just mentioned charging infrastructure, and it struck a chord with me because we've recently released our introduction to Road Freight Electrification training at the Smart Freight Center Academy. And when I was going through the training, one of the sections that I actually found most interesting was the section on charging infrastructure, because it's not something I had really thought about. And okay, granted, I'm not a logistics expert and I'm also not directly involved with fleet electrification, but it's a very interesting consideration that organizations need to make, where if we're going electric, but we have long distance routes that we need to plan, we need to think about making sure that the infrastructure exists to support that.
Exactly. And it's not just that. It's not just for companies who need to do long distance transports. In the past, fleet managers just needed to care about the diesel trucks. Refueling was fairly simple and fairly quick. But now with battery or electric freight vehicles that rely on batteries and charging of the batteries, which typically take very long in comparison to refueling a diesel tank. And now the challenge is a lot more complex.
Yeah, and there's a lot of moving parts for organizations to consider. And that's why I think the work of our Fleet Electrification Coalition is incredibly valuable. Could you maybe tell us a little bit more about the Fleet Electrification, what we do, who, why, where, what? You could paint us a picture.
Yeah, I'll try. It's a beast that keeps on morphing into different types of animals. I'm mixing up metaphors. It's wrong. Anyway, the Fleet Electrification Coalition is a partnership of more than 50 plus shippers and fleet owners. And basically, we're coming together to deploy in a large scale manner electric trucks across the logistics sector. And our main objective is to enable 20% zero emission truck sales by 2030 and 100% by 2040 globally. And this is a very big challenge. And we know that it's a big challenge. That means, although we say, we're trying to enable truck sales, what that really means is that we need to enable, or we need to put together the entire ecosystem where up to the point where truck sales, electric truck sales, make sense. Because for logistics operations, it is really important that the vehicles that they purchase is fit for their business, it's fit for purpose, and it can earn them money, right? And that means they are very sensitive to the costs, they're very sensitive to the transport capability of the vehicle, and they need to make sure all the, major concerns about range anxiety or operational challenges are addressed. And so we're looking at all of them, and we're trying to lean on the vast network of experts that we have. We're addressing a lot of challenges in working groups, and we're doing a lot to bring guidance to the road freight sector.
The Fleet Electrification Coalition has big goals, the main objective being enabling 30% zero emission truck sales by 2030 and 100% by 2040 globally. And I think that out of context, especially, that can sound like huge ambitions. It is big ambitions, but it's also through coalitions like the Fleet Electrification Coalition that we're able to move this needle and move this forward, drive this forward, dare I say. Tharsis, we're going to wrap up episode 2 there. We have spent this episode looking a lot at EVs and Smart Freight Center's focus on EVs. For those of you who missed episode 1, we spoke about what is road freight electrification and just a basic understanding of it. And in episode 3, which you definitely don't want to miss, we're going to be talking about the role of education in road freight electrification. If you're super antsy to get learning, don't let us hold you back. Go to academy.smartfreightcenter.org and have a look at our introduction to road freight electrification training and all of our other trainings that are there as well. Tharsis, thank you so much for joining me for episode 2. I look forward to chatting with you again for episode 3.